Ever since I started this channel, I wanted to make a video that discusses user experience or UX in games. And thanks to having recently built a PC, I finally found a game that would allow me to do so. That game is Into the Breach, the phenomenal sophomore effort from Subset Games, creators of the smash hit 2012 release Faster Than Light. While I think everyone has a basic understanding of what UX is, I personally wanted to learn more about it. To accomplish that, I read articles, watched videos, including development postmortems of Into the Breach, wrote to one of the game's creators, Justin Ma, and spoke with an old friend, Brooke Allison, who is an employee of Sprung Studios, one of the leading external development studios that specializes in game UX UI. So today, I want to dive into the topic of video game user experience and state my case for what makes Into the Breach such a standout game. User experience sounds like a basic topic to discuss and explain. Simply put, it's how a game feels. But that doesn't really shed much light on how the user experience is actually conceptualized, iterated upon, and delivered to the player. If you want a more specific definition of what UX designers do, I'll say this: they must ensure that a game is both usable and engaging. Again, that sounds pretty straightforward in terms of end goals. However, the path to achieving this is anything but. Take the layout for a game's menus and inventory systems, for example. While the actual look of a menu falls under a UI designer's responsibility, the layout and function of these components pertain to UX design. A franchise that has always struggled for me in this regard is the Borderlands series. While the moments of action are fun, the overall gameplay loop struggles to keep me engaged because I find navigating the menus to be such a chore. What's worse is that spending copious amounts of time in the menus is unavoidable, as you are constantly tinkering with your character's build. Time spent in the menus of a game like Borderlands 3 could have been dramatically reduced if the game employed a quick drop mechanic like in Diablo 3, which allows players to equip, drop, or store an item all without having to enter a single menu. Another essential consideration is to make sure that objects which look like they should behave in a certain way do in fact behave that way, such as the never too far away red barrel that goes boom, or how games mark climbable surfaces with specific colors so the player always knows that they can be interacted with. These two instances are actually where a game's UX is supported by its UI, as UI pertains to how things look, whereas UX is again how games feel. The last example I'll cover are sensory indicators. These let the player know what is happening in the world around them. Like in Cuphead, you know to prepare for a specific enemy attack because of the various load-up animations they have. Or in Doom Eternal, when your grenade is ready for use after cooldown, you hear a short beep. These indicators help the player take in a wealth of information, decode it, and utilize it even in the midst of what looks to be chaos. Put these and other considerations into a game, and a player will probably continue to play, because even if the game is difficult, they at the very least understand it. This is no small feat for a game to achieve, because a bad tutorial section, often referred to as the FTUI, first time user experience, or inconsistencies in the game's rule set can make it feel disjointed and will consequently struggle to retain players. A game that does a stellar job at avoiding unnecessary confusion is Mark of the Ninja. Players of this side-scrolling stealth game rely heavily on the contextual clues that the game provides. Aside from a few actions, everything that happens in the game will create noise, which is visualized by these expanding rings from each source of sound, and the louder the sound, the larger the ring. This allows players to time their movements and attacks with enemy patrol patterns so as not to alert them. When something is outside of the playable character's line of sight, it is covered in shadows, making it more difficult for the player to fully assess the situation. Thanks to a visual representation of the character's eyeline, the player knows where to position themselves to remove those blurring shadows. And finally, any ranged action, whether it be grappling hooks or throwing knives, will lock onto a specific target or show you their travel path so the player knows what it will make contact with. These easy-to-understand mechanics in Mark of the Ninja provide a clear-cut set of rules that players can rely on in any situation, so that if failure does occur, they are upset at themselves rather than an inconsistent game. Which brings me to engagement in games, which is essentially player retention. Engagement necessitates motivation. Without it, then there would be no engagement from the player. Or if there was any, it would be fleeting. Like when No Man's Sky launched and traveling to new planets to harvest resources lost its novelty after the opening hours because players weren't given any meaningful reason to continue exploring. The process of motivating a player involves providing meaning and context to their eventual actions in-game. Unless your game is advertised as a collectathon, then you shouldn't have objectives that don't offer the player anything in return upon completion. If this winds up being the case, the player might feel like they've wasted their time playing the game. This is how the original Assassin's Creed handled its collectible flags, which numbered in the hundreds. Players who managed to track these down were rewarded with an in-game achievement rather than anything tangible. While the game itself is generally well regarded, this particular aspect remains a talked about example of how not to handle in-game rewards. That being said, Assassin's Creed debuted in 2008, and holistic approaches to UX are still ramping up in the industry. So how have more recent titles handled collectible items or reward systems? Well, Ghost of Tsushima comes to mind as it has a litany of points of interest to discover and interact with. In fact, the most apparent mechanical theme throughout the game is discovery. The game wants you to explore its world, which is visually enticing enough as it is. Then, it provides tools to aid player exploration, such as the yellow birds that act as destination guides. And finally, the points of interest reward the player upon arrival in the form of cosmetic items or upgrades to your character. Another term for this type of mechanic in game design would be extrinsic motivators. Ghost of Tsushima consistently puts worthwhile rewards in front of the player to keep them exploring and engaged while doing so. Another form of motivation can come from what are called intrinsic motivators. These have the potential for garnering much deeper engagement from players. An example of these that I think most players have encountered would be when a game teases them early on by bringing their attention to a currently unattainable item. The game does this in hopes that the player will be motivated to eventually figure out how to get said item. Then, when they finally have that aha moment and go back to that once restricted item to use their new knowledge and access it, they will most likely feel a sense of agency and autonomy over the outcome of their fortune in the game. The first time I experienced this sort of motivation in games was with the very first Ratchet & Clank. There's a character you meet early in the game who mentions that he can build a weapon called the Rhino, but it's going to take a small fortune for him to do so. Acquiring the money takes a substantial amount of time, which drove me further into the game and placed me in shootouts with progressively harder enemies. While I was busy shooting stuff and getting rich, I was also increasing my proficiency with the game's mechanics. So by the time I returned to my arms-dealing friend, I felt a sense of satisfaction at my accomplishment. Plus, I got a badass weapon. Speaking of skill, this is basically the entire Souls-like genre's MO. The games are marketed as punishing experiences with the intended reward being deep player satisfaction once they've overcome the bosses that once seemed impossible. Not to say this is the only reward for progressing through the game, but it is the one that made the genre famous. That being said, it's important to remember that games like Bloodborne and the others I've mentioned can't just rely on any one component of UX and hope that it will be enough to satisfy players. As I'm sure you're aware at this point, it's a multifaceted endeavor that requires constant iteration and attention to detail. And that is what finally brings us back to Into the Breach. Let me first set the stage for what kind of game Into the Breach is. It's set in a futuristic world where giant mechs are fighting giant bugs, though they all appear miniature on screen. It's a roguelike with turn-based gameplay and is less about ongoing strategy throughout the levels and more about reactionary decisions to each set of enemy actions. The developers themselves even stated that Into the Breach is a puzzle game with the guise of traditional strategy game elements. Now, this game has two twists that really make it unique. One being that every enemy action is telegraphed, so the player always knows what the enemy is going to do next. If you're asking yourself what the fun in that is and how that could possibly be challenging, well, that's where the second twist comes in. Because in Into the Breach, the health and survival of your individual units is of secondary concern. The primary directive of each and every level is protecting the stationary buildings placed on the map. If the buildings are attacked or damaged, then your grid power level, shown at the top of the screen, decreases. Basically, the player must focus on mitigating the damage to the buildings in any given scenario, rather than protecting themselves. If this brief description hasn't highlighted this game's brilliance, then that's okay, because as I cover more of its depth, my hope is that it will eventually begin to resonate with you. Into the Breach took 4 years to develop, which might seem crazy for a game that just looks like a more colorful chessboard. But after learning more about it, I can understand why it took so long. From the beginning, the creators Justin Ma and Matthew Davis knew they wanted a streamlined UX/UI, so that at any point, the player could look at the board and understand precisely what the situation at hand was. Eventually, they also decided on having telegraphed enemy attacks. These elements seem like a great foundation on which to build a game, and they are, but the process to actually make that game fun was arduous to say the least. This is because their ambitious scope for the game was constrained by those very foundational elements they were originally committed to. It took them years, however, to understand this. For instance, in the build of the game that shipped, players could only marginally upgrade their mech units, with things such as damage boosts, movement upgrades, and a select few additional weapons to choose from. Whereas during development, the creators had envisioned and even created huge upgrade trees that could be explored by players throughout their runs. But most of those upgrade trees had to be scrapped in order to find a recipe for success. Furthermore, considerable amounts of story content had to be left out as well, because it ultimately couldn't thematically coalesce with the reduced systems found in the game's final build. In fact, entire builds of the game they had spent months or even years working on were at one point or another completely thrown out so they could start fresh. But all of that begs the question, why? Why did this game ship with what appears to be a diluted pool of content, and if that's the case, how can it be called a success? The answers to those questions can be obtained if we think back to some of those core pillars of UX design, usability and engageability. As I said, the team wanted a streamlined UX/UI that didn't require players to sift through numerous menus or pages upon pages of information. In tandem with the telegraphed attacks that they were so committed to including, this proved to be perhaps the most influential factor in the game's design. While the relationship between these two elements was indeed symbiotic, that is not to say it was without conflict. Think about it. If you have to visually show the breadth of upcoming interactions in a particular turn, then there will be inevitable limitations to what you can actually show. An overabundance of information will lead to a cluttered screen and the player having to spend more time than they should looking for answers as to what it all means. This meant that the iconography which would be displayed across the duration of a level underwent constant iteration. To help explain all of this, let's dive into some of the realizations the team made along the way that led to the game's final build. To start, they realized players needed to know not only what was attacking what, but also what those attacks in fact did. Those are the icons you see jutting out from each enemy on the board. This meant they needed to design weapons for both the player and enemy that could be described by the game's UX/UI, rather than the other way around. Again, they were trying to avoid the overabundance issue. The solution was to construct every weapon based on 3 types of attacks: artillery, melee, and projectile. Artillery type attacks are shown by the arching dotted line with an arrow at the end. Melee has just the arrow with no dotted line, and projectiles have both the dotted line and the arrow as well, only this time it lies flat along the board. And whenever you hover over an enemy with your mouse, you are instantly greeted with this information. Something you may have noticed at this point about the behavior of attacks is that they are always going in one of 4 directions: up, down, left, or right. Another word for this sort of system is orthogonal projection. This was of course another conscious decision from the developers, as it streamlines the player experience and decision making. Take an artillery attack for example. In other games, these types of weapons have attack radiuses that encompass large areas and can be used in many different directions. In order to properly plan their attack, players must be aware of which objects are within range of the attack. This can become cumbersome, however, if after every turn when the player moves, they have to check this information again and again. Into the Breach avoids this problem by utilizing orthogonal projection. So from just a glance, the player knows whether an enemy is within range of an attack. Even with all these included features, it's not to say that the game expects you to remember everything without any help. As simple as the rules of the game are, they can still be a lot to juggle in the midst of battle. This is where the idea for a single screen UX/UI really shines. If at any point the player is unsure of something on the board, all the information they need is just a quick move of the mouse and a button press away. It doesn't come from pulling up a screen-filling menu with multiple tabs and submenus. Instead, respectfully sized boxes appear instantaneously. Say you don't even want those to appear, then you can still see tons of information just from hovering over a unit or tile. Doing so highlights things such as building health, special environmental tiles to show their effects and what triggers them, and interactive entities that are level specific. What's great about these panels is that the text is kept to a bare minimum because, let's be real, nobody reads. That being said, one particular piece of information is of vital importance to a player's plan of attack. That being what a unit's attack actually does. While the direction and type of attack is heavily restricted, the behavior of each attack has tons of variety. I could describe a few examples of this, but they would probably only confuse you, and this is exactly what the developers came to realize as well. While there are brief descriptions about weapon behaviors found in the corresponding boxes, I have never read a single one of them. Instead, I watch these little videos that play on repeat and demonstrate precisely how it will behave. The best part about all of this, is that my view of the board, which holds the key to my success, is never obstructed. All the decisions that will lead to victory can be made using the plethora of intuitive tools right there in front of me. While I didn't touch on all of the minutiae that makes this game's design so intelligent, what I did decide to highlight should suffice to show this game's usability. As I mentioned, Into the Breach is a roguelike, which in the case of this particular iteration on the subgenre means more emphasis is put on the individual playthroughs that a player will experience rather than an overarching storyline or any significant long-term progression. Deciding to create a roguelike game is a double-edged sword, because much of the game's engagement comes from just the core gameplay loop alone, as that is usually the most time-consuming aspect. But if that gameplay loop is unsatisfying, there really isn't much to keep the player coming back for more. Now, this video should serve as a testament to where I stand on Into the Breach's success in this regard. However, for others who are critical of this game, this would be one of the areas where they take issue. Even the developers acknowledged that they were forced to settle on choosing the least worst option when it came to one of the game's most defining characteristics, having to protect the buildings. During development, the team found that the only way to ensure players would care about protecting the buildings is if they were tied to the game's fail state by way of overall player health. Now, having this be the primary goal of the player is not where the issue lies. The problem arises if the player doesn't feel challenged enough by the obstacles in their way toward achieving this goal. While I personally found Into the Breach's gameplay challenging enough to always keep me on my toes, the user reviews of this game ran the gamut in this respect. Some players said the game was far too difficult, while others felt it posed no real challenge whatsoever. In other words, these players' engagement was stymied by the construction of the game itself. If you're asking yourself why the creators didn't try and address the game's difficulty, well, they did. The game actually has 3 different settings, so the player does have some freedom to experiment a little bit with each playthrough. More importantly, however, the team realized during development that the game they were creating didn't need to fit into a box when it came to difficulty. As the game began to crystallize, they realized that the mechanics they were implementing were fun and engaging regardless of the overall challenge. And therefore, they didn't need to create an inherently difficult game. There is something deeply satisfying in solving each turn's puzzle, whether that takes me 30 seconds or 10 minutes, which seems like an appropriate segue into more directly answering those questions I posed earlier. It doesn't really matter how much content a game like this has, because you're not drawn to the notion of unlocking new abilities or going on a grand narrative journey. Into the Breach enables the player to experiment and enact their creative problem solving by way of its inherent accessibility. A game can succeed for any number of reasons, one of which being its size and scope, but what Into the Breach excels at is its self-restraint. The developers knew that if their formula were to resonate with any sizable audience, they needed to adhere to the delicate balance that the game itself required. In doing so, they created a game that is by no means complex, yet is tremendously deep with possibilities. Well, that's about all I got for you guys today. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you very much. I know it was kind of a longer video than what I've posted so far, but if you learned something and you enjoyed it, go ahead and subscribe to see more. Drop a like if you do feel so inclined, and go buy Into the Breach. It's $15 on PC, Mac, and Switch. You got no reason not to. Peace.